Let me try that one more time. Okay, good. Well, good morning and Happy New Year. It's good to see all of you in 2025. Wow, it's hard to believe. I think it was Ruth just was saying, it just seems like yesterday was the whole Y2K thing, right? Time goes so quickly. The words to that song are pretty challenging, aren't they? Pretty challenging words. Well, this morning, we're going to be beginning a series on stewardship. And for the next few weeks, we're going to be talking about the ABCs of stewardship. And as we begin this series, I just want to refer you to a resource entitled The ABCs of Stewardship, which is published by Enjoy Ministries and authored by John Maxwell, because that's where most of my material is going to be coming from. Now, I'd like you all to think of a person whom you greatly admire, somebody you really respect and have a lot of love for. You have somebody in mind? Now, I want you to think about what it is that this person, what is it about this person that you appreciate so much? What is it that really draws you to them and what you really admire about them? Just take a second to think about that. Well, someone did a survey several years ago, and they asked some people to do the same thing. Think of somebody they really admired, and then they asked them to list the characteristics of the person they really admired. And here's the traits they came up with: spiritual, kind, integrous, faithful, loving, exemplary, consistent, compassionate, understanding, truthful, considerate, and sacrificial. Now, the reason the person took this survey was they wanted to prove that the one thing that makes people attractive to others is their attitude. Now, what's interesting to note is the list that I just read, most of those things are characteristics of attitudes. They're attitude qualities in an individual. Did you notice that I didn't say anything about skill or ability? No one said, well, she's my best friend because she's so good looking. I mean, either good looking is not an important thing for that person, or maybe they just have a lot of ugly friends. I don't know. Well, the reason I point this out is because it seems like we spend a whole lot of time working on our abilities and our looks and our skills. Now, these things are important. I'm not trying to minimize them, but I think that we can all think of somebody who's really good looking or talented, but they have a really terrible attitude, and so nobody really likes them. You see, it's your attitude that makes you attractive to other people, and your attitude is also important to God. It's not your abilities or your skills or your gifts or your talents that are of utmost importance to Him. It's your attitude toward them and what you do with them. That's what makes you attractive and godly. And what you do with them is called stewardship. So I'd like to give you a definition of stewardship. I think that's going to help us to get started in this area. And if you have your YouVersion app, I would encourage you to get that out because there's places to take sermon notes in there. If you don't have that, that's okay. Get a pen and you have your bulletin that you can write in. Here's a definition of stewardship. Stewardship is utilizing God-given abilities to manage God-given resources to accomplish God-ordained results. Let me say that again. Stewardship is utilizing God-given abilities to manage God-given resources to accomplish God-ordained results. Now, in Luke 21, we find the story of the widow who put 2 mites into the offering. You're probably familiar with this account. And Jesus said this, "Truly, I say to you that this widow has put in more than all the rest." Now, there was a devotional writer who asked this question about that. How is it possible to add together the total offering of countless rich men and declare it less than 2 mites put in by the poor widow? How is it possible that so little could be so much? Well, this is how he answered that question. Jesus' arithmetic is not hard to comprehend when you understand, as he did, that the secret of giving is not the amount that was given, but what was given up. It's not the abundance, but the attitude. Jesus teaches us that liberality isn't determined by the amount of our possessions, but by the disposition of our giving. Giving is not a function of cold numbers, but the results of a warm heart. That's why you can give without loving, but you can't love without giving. Please open your Bibles or your Bible app to the story of the Good Samaritan in Luke 10 that was read earlier. Luke chapter 10, beginning at verse 25. Now, we see that this expert in the law asks, "Who is my neighbor?" And Jesus answers with this parable. And as we look at this parable, we find that there are three attitudes exhibited here. Here's the first one. What's yours is mine, and I'm going to take it. What's yours is mine, and I'm going to take it. And this is the attitude of the robber. He was a thief. I mean, he was looking at this man walking down the road, and he thought, what's yours is mine, and I'm going to take it. And so he beat him up, and he robbed him. And immediately we might think to ourselves, and we stand back in horror and shock and say that we want nothing to do with this attitude. After all, what is that attitude? It's an attitude of greed, isn't it? We understand that what's yours is not mine, and it's not right for me to take it. But in this story, this is the attitude of the robber. You know, there's a great example of this found in Aesop's fables. Maybe some of you know this. I don't even know if they teach that in school anymore. Well, there was this dog who sneaked into this butcher shop and he stole a big fat piece of meat. And he ran out with it. And as he was going to his place to eat it, he had to cross this slow-moving stream. And as he was crossing the stream, he looked down and he saw another dog there with a big piece of meat in his mouth. Well, he wanted that piece of meat. So he opened up his mouth to grab the other dog's piece of meat. And you know what happened. He lost his own piece of meat. He wanted that meat so much that he ended up losing what he had. It's that simple attitude of greed. And that tells you what greed will do to you. That dog had the attitude of what's yours is mine, and I'm going to take it. And we can see how far that got him. Now, let me ask you this. Who is the owner of everything you have? You see, when we understand stewardship, we recognize the fact that God is really the owner of everything, and we are simply the managers. And there's a big difference between having that view and the view that says it's all mine. You see, if God is the owner and I'm the manager, then we're going to have a heart of gratitude. There's going to be a sense of thankfulness for what God has done for us and what he's given us. But if you think that you're the owner, then you're going to end up with a heart of pride. And you'll begin to say, well, look at all I've accomplished. Look what I've done. And also, a person who believes that God is the owner of everything and that they're simply the managers of what God has put at their disposal will have a mindset of God's kingdom. Because if you understand that God owns everything, then everything you have is for God and for his kingdom. But if you think that you are the owner of everything, then everything you have is going to be about my kingdom and what good it's going to do for me, not for God. And then also, if you understand that God is the owner of everything, then you're going to understand that these things are transient. Because as the old saying goes, it's here today and gone tomorrow. You see, many of the things that God brings to us are really meant to flow through us and not stop at us. They flow through us to somebody else. But if you don't understand that, then you're going to treat all of your possessions as things that are permanent. We're going to put a permanent value on them and a permanent effort into them, when really, they're not that important. If you understand that God is the owner of everything and you are the manager, then everything that you're going to do is going to be for others and not just about yourself. So what does this mean? Well, remember, this robber had this attitude of what's yours is mine and I'm going to take it. And when we think about that, again, we stand opposed to that in the earthly realm, don't we? When we see something like that, maybe on the news or something, we become appalled. But in the spiritual realm, oftentimes we miss it. For example, let's say you made $500 this week. How much of that $500 is God's? Now, if you say, well, $50 because 10% is a tithe and the tithe belongs to the Lord, well, then you're missing it. And that happens a lot. Because what we're really saying here is, well, I'm going to love God with 10%. But if you answer that by saying, well, all of it belongs to God, well, then you're right. Then you understand stewardship. But too many people tend to stick with just that 10%. But really, all of it belongs to Him, doesn't it? Every breath you breathe, everything there is, every blessing, everything you have belongs to God. So don't take from Him what is His and think that it's just yours. The second attitude that comes up in this story is that of the Levite and the priest. And basically, here's what they said. What's mine is mine, and I'm going to keep it. What's mine is mine, and I'm going to keep it. In other words, they weren't going to rob anybody. They certainly weren't going to take something from somebody else. They wouldn't even think of doing that. They're not like that. But notice what the priest and the Levite did. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place, saw him and passed by on the other side. Now, neither of these men were going to rob this poor man. They weren't going to take his possessions, but they operated under the attitude of what's mine is mine, and I'm going to keep it. So let's talk about this kind of person for just a second. Now, interestingly enough, this Levite and priest were very religious men, weren't they? But it's the only time in the Gospels that you're going to find Jesus actually talking negatively about a priest, this person who cared for the temple. Now, more than likely, the priest and the Levite were coming from the temple, from Jerusalem, going to Jericho. They had done their part in caring for the temple. But there was this law that said a priest wasn't supposed to touch anything that was unclean. So, when they each saw this man who was half dead, maybe even think that he was already dead, they knew that they couldn't touch him because in their minds, he would be unclean. And you can't touch somebody like that. Priests and Levites were not allowed to touch the unclean thing. And so by the law, they couldn't help him. Well, let's stop here for a moment. Sometimes we can find religious people who have their set of rules. They follow their legalistic rules, and they can't see beyond that tunnel vision that they have. They can't see the need around them. But they follow their rules in the name of Christianity. Now remember that Jesus said that the law is good, but he also said he came to fulfill that law. In fact, he said, and actually he lived, that love and grace are above the law. You know, nothing's worse than a person who doesn't understand that person, and they still think that the law is above love and grace. The problem is that they're not helping anyone, because as they say, it's not what I'm supposed to do according to the law. They're so bound up in their laws and rituals, and they're letting people die on the side of the road who need help. And that's exactly what was happening in this parable that Jesus told. The attitude of the priest and the Levite was, what's mine is mine, and I'm going to keep it. In this case, what they kept was their rituals. I think that these are the kind of people who go through life and they really don't hurt anyone. They don't break rules. They don't make enemies. The kind of person I'm talking about. They just kind of keep to themselves. Your world is there and my world is here. I'll draw a circle around myself and you draw a circle around yourself, and I won't bother you, you won't bother me, and they just kind of go through life isolated. John Maxwell, he related how he learned this lesson actually from his grandfather. He was a teenager on his grandfather's farm, and his grandfather was planting fruit trees, and he was actually 80 years old at this time. And John asked his grandfather, "Why are you planting these fruit trees?" You see, basically he was saying, "Grandpa, you're 80 years old. By the time these trees produce fruit, you're going to be dead. So why are you planting them? You're not going to be able to enjoy them, so why do it?" So his grandfather sat down and he said, "John, let me tell you, you're right. I probably will never taste an apple from any of these trees, but I want you to understand that the world doesn't stop when I die. Many of the things that I enjoyed when I came into this world were given to me by people who had gone on before, who realized that I would need apples to eat. Have you ever eaten an apple from a tree you didn't plant?" Well, I don't know about you, but I've never planted an apple tree. I've eaten plenty of apples. You see, life is more than just our circles. We're blessed by those who came to understand that and gave and contributed. And in the same way, really, we're responsible in our lives to give beyond our lives. John Maxwell's grandfather said, "I'm a Christian, and when I die, I'll go to be with Jesus. But I want to leave something good in this world when I go." So if you have the attitude of the Levite and the priest that says, "What's mine is mine, and I'm going to keep it," well, it's certainly better than "What's yours is mine, and I'm going to take it." But it's still not good enough. We need the attitude of the Samaritan. Here's what his attitude is. What's mine is yours, and I'm going to give it. There are some similarities among these three men. First of all, they all saw that there was a problem. They saw that there was this man who was needy. Now, their reactions to the need was different, but they all saw that there was a need. Too often, people say, "If I had the opportunity, then I'd give. If only I had this, then I'd give." But let me tell you that all of us can become givers, no matter what our circumstances are. Our financial situation doesn't matter. Giving doesn't have to be in the form of money. You see, we have time, talents, caring, helping, reaching out, loving someone, touching someone. All of us have the opportunity to give. And if you're one of those people who, for whatever reason, think that you can't, well, then just let me expound to you from the Greek a little bit. Baloney. It's simply not true. I've seen the poorest of people who were some of the best givers in their lives. Giving has nothing to do with the amount of money you have or with the amount of possessions you have. It has everything to do with your attitude. Another similarity among these men is that they all had other things to do. They were all busy. They were all on this journey. None of them, when they started off that day, said, "Oh, I've got nothing to do today, so I'm going to go look for somebody to help." They were all going somewhere. They were all doing something. Again, we can find people who say, "Well, I can't help because I'm too busy. I have a lot on my agenda." But this is wrong. The reason we help people isn't because of our schedules. We help people because on our priority list, people come above things. These men all had reasons not to help. The Levite and the priest had reasons of ceremonial law and purity. The Samaritan had reasons of race and prejudice. After all, the Jews hated the Samaritans. But the Samaritan's attitude helped him to overcome prejudice, looking beyond the stigma of who he was and who the Jewish person thought he was. It also helped him to give up his conveniences. After all, he gave up his time, he gave up his energy, his money, his possessions. His attitude, what's mine is yours, and I'm going to give it. So let me make 4 observations from this parable. First, attitude is more important than ability. Too often we focus on skills and say, well, I don't have that ability. I just can't do it. But you don't have to worry about what you don't have. Just be concerned with what you do have. If God has given you anything, then it's because he believes you have the ability to handle it for his kingdom. But you have to have the right attitude to do it. You know, maybe you've heard this. I know I've heard people say, if I had $1 million, then I'd give half of it to the church and to the poor and to missions. But you know what? You don't need to worry about what you would do with $1 million. Just worry about what you do with what you have. Because God will give you tomorrow according to what you're doing with what you have today. Luke 16:10 says, whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. Attitude is much more important than ability. I mean, we found that out when we talked about the characteristics of people that we're drawn to. It wasn't their skills or their looks, it was their attitude. And the second observation that I'd like to make is that attitude is more important than position. Your attitude about people and about life is much more important than about what position you hold in life. I mean, in fact, if you want to talk about position, look at the position of the Levite and the priest. They were religious leaders. These were very religious positions. I mean, if anybody ought to be helping the Samaritan, it should be the religious guys, right? They should be trained in that. But you don't have to be a pastor or a minister to help people. Do what you can where you are. Take what God has given you and use it where you are. You don't need any more training. When Jesus was talking to that expert in the law about who his neighbor is, he was basically saying to him this: listen, I'm tired of your quoting scripture all the time. I'd like for you to quit talking about it and start doing it. And that's what he expects from us. And the third observation that I'd like to make is that your attitude is more important than timing. Some people will say, I just couldn't help because it just wasn't the right time. It's interesting to note that it was actually a much better time for the priest and the Levite to help than it was for the Samaritan to help. I mean, if that guy was half dead while the first two went by, certainly he was at least 3/4 dead by the time the Samaritan went by. I mean, we have to remember that when we see somebody in need, it may not be the right time. It may not be convenient for us. But Jesus says, don't worry about that. Instead, he tells us to develop right attitudes about stewardship by learning to love God above everything else. I mean, even the expert in the law answered Jesus, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind. I mean, in other words, if you want to have the right attitude, then love God first. And when you love God first, then you'll love your neighbor as yourself. One flows from the other. And here's my fourth observation. Become an active giver now. Don't wait. Become a giver now. In this story, when this expert in the law wanted to get into a theological discourse about who his neighbor was, Jesus asked him a very important question. We find it in verses 36 and 37. Jesus asked, which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. And then what did Jesus say? Go and do likewise. In other words, quit theorizing and start working. So now, let me bring this down to a very practical level. In your sermon notes in your YouVersion app, or maybe in your bulletin, I want you to think about this, and then I want you to write this down. Ask yourself this question: who needs help? Who do I know who could use my help? And then I want you to write that person's name down. And then I want you to write down what they need. Maybe it's a couple who need some help with some babysitting so they can have a night out. Maybe it's an elderly person in your neighborhood who just needs someone to visit with them for an hour. Whatever it is, write it down. And then the second thing I'd like you to do is to eliminate your excuses. I mean, if we're honest with ourselves, oftentimes the truth is that when we hear of a need, our first response is to start thinking of all the reasons that why we haven't, why we shouldn't, why we wouldn't, why we can't. Eliminate them. No more excuses. And then the third thing I'd like you to do is do it. Take care of that need that you wrote down. Before next Sunday, do something for someone else. How many of you know of someone who has a need? Raise your hand. Pretty much everybody. I mean, if you can't think of somebody, come ask me. I'll find somebody for you. It's time for us to put what we know into action. We're going to be singing the song, "Here Am I, My Lord." My challenge is for each of us to make this our commitment, to make sure that we're not holding anything back, but instead to use what God has given to us with the attitude of helping others. Here am I, my Lord. Help me to obey what you've called me to do. Won't you sing with me?